evolution, do you know? Like, in your experience, any numbers? Like, I'm just trying to say how often it happens, somebody questioning such a major theory as evolution. Any guess? I mean, before the talk. Sorry? Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's good that people are aware of that debate. Some people don't even know that it's a theory and it's being debated, and they just take it for a fact as much as gravity. That's good to know that you are aware of that. And so we have Michael Cremo here. So he has a lot of extensive introduction about how we got into this topic. So I don't want to steal that as part of my introduction. And so I'll just go over the introduction of him as a person. I've known him for like more than 10, 15 years. And he is a very thoughtful, methodical person with extreme intellectual honesty. And he expects that of others. So that's where his research was born into this book. So the scope of this talk is just questioning the current theory and based on the evidences available. But he's not going to present an alternate theory in this talk. You have to wait for a year for that to happen if I have my job until then. So now the scope of this talk is questioning the current theory based on the available evidences from researched literature. And the next topic he usually presents is called human devolution, presenting an alternate theory. So there are books for that outside, so that's your only resource right now. So with that, let's welcome Michael Cremo to Google with a big hand.
Thank you for the nice introduction. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to hear a little something about the topic Forbidden Archaeology, Evidence for Extreme Human Antiquity. So just to keep things honest, I'm a researcher in human origins for the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, and my research is inspired by my studies in the ancient Sanskrit writings in India, especially the Puranas, the historical writings. Now, for many today, those two things would be complete disqualifications for me to say anything about a scientific topic in scientific circles. However, quite surprisingly to me even, there are people within the scientific world who are interested in hearing what I have to say. And I've been invited to present my ideas at some of the leading scientific institutions in the world, such as the Royal Institution in London, the Russian Academy of Science in Moscow, Department of Anthropology, the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, and many others around the world. So the question I'm dealing with is, how old is the human species? Today, the most common answer to that question comes from the modern followers of Charles Darwin, who proposed that the first humans like us came into existence less than 200,000 years ago. Before that, they would say there were no humans like us present on this planet, simply more primitive ape-like human ancestors. However, the Puranas, the historical writings of ancient India, give a different idea, namely that humans have been present for vast periods of time on this planet, going back many millions of years. Now, of course, in scientific circles, I wouldn't expect anyone to take a statement from some ancient writings as evidence. So in the scientific circles where I'm invited to speak, I do something else. I make a prediction, namely, if what the Puranas say about human antiquity is true, there should be reports of archaeological evidence for humans existing much further back in time than 200,000 years ago, perhaps going back many millions of years. So my method for testing that prediction is to examine all archaeological reports from the time of Darwin to the present. And not just in English, I have a reading knowledge of most of the major European languages. So when I speak about examining reports from the scientific literature, I mean two kinds of scientific literature, the primary and the secondary scientific literature. By primary scientific literature, I mean original reports by archaeologists, geologists, paleontologists, and other earth scientists reported in the professional peer-reviewed scientific literature. By secondary literature, I mean things that are based on the primary literature, such as textbooks, for example. So I had two principal findings. The first finding is not so surprising. There are no reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the current secondary literature, textbooks, survey studies, and things of that sort. My second finding was a little more interesting. There are many reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the primary scientific literature, past and present. So I collected those reports in this book, Forbidden Archaeology, which was reviewed in most of the professional academic and scientific journals that deal with the question of human origins. So this constitutes a kind of peer review. Now, as you might expect, many of those reviews were negative, some extremely so. However, quite surprisingly to me even some of my critics were able to point out some positive aspects of the work. For example, David Oldroyd, a noted historian of science, in a 28-page review article about the book, asked the question, so has Forbidden Archaeology made any contribution to the literature on paleoanthropology? Our answer is a guarded yes for two reasons. First, he said, much of the historical material has not been scrutinized in such detail before. In other words, as a professional historian of science dealing with these particular questions, he had not encountered any work which had gone into history in such depth before. And second, he said the book raises, quote, a central problematic regarding the lack of certainty in scientific truth claims. Now, after the book was published and many of the reviews came out, I began speaking about the topic of the book at scientific conferences. The first time I did that was in 1984 at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress. It's the world's largest international organization of archaeologists. I presented a paper there called Pharaonic Time in the Archaeological Record. And that paper was selected for publication in a peer-reviewed conference proceedings volume called Time in Archaeology, which came out from Routledge, a major scientific publisher. And subsequently, I've presented papers on my work at many other meetings of the World Archaeological Congress, and also meetings of the European Association of Archaeologists. And the reason I'm mentioning this is just to show that the kinds of things I'm saying are part of the scientific discourse in the scientific disciplines that are related to human origins. Now, admittedly, it's not a popular voice. It's an extreme minority voice, limited maybe even to a minority of one. But still, surprisingly enough to many people, it is a part of the discourse. So one of the questions I had about the kind of evidence I'm talking about is, why exactly is it missing from the current secondary literature if it's there in the primary literature? And I'm proposing it's because of a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. And here I'm not talking about a satanic conspiracy to suppress truth. I'm talking about something that philosophers of science and historians of science have understood for a long time, namely that theoretical preconceptions can influence how scientists may react to different categories of evidence that come to their attention. We can call the blue box the knowledge filter. What it represents is the dominant consensus in a scientific discipline at a particular point in time. And reports of evidence that conform to the dominant consensus will pass through the knowledge filter fairly easily, whereas reports of evidence that radically contradict a dominant consensus tend to be filtered out, ignored, forgotten, set aside, dismissed. And this was something that one of the reviewers of Forbidden Archaeology noted. The French archaeologist Marilyn Patou-Mati noted in her review of Forbidden Archaeology and L'Anthropologie. Cremo and Thompson have written a provocative work that raises the problem of the influence of the dominant ideas of a time period on scientific research. These ideas can compel the researchers to orient their analyses according to the conceptions that are permitted by the scientific community. So it was interesting to me that an archaeologist grasped correctly what, the point we were trying to make in the book, and wasn't just dismissing it as, oh, these are conspiracy theorists. I'm now going to go over some of the kinds of reports that I'm talking about. This is Virginia Steen McIntyre, an American geologist. She was involved in dating an archaeological site at Huayatlaco in Mexico. There, archaeologists had discovered projectile points and other stone tools and weapons. And they were, of course, interested in how old these things were. This is the excavation at Huayatlaco. And the artifacts were photographed intact in the layers of rock in which they were found. Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues used 4 different methods to date the site. Animal bones with butchering marks were found in the same layers with the stone tools. The geologists used the uranium series method to date those bones. They got an age of 245,000 years. Above the layer with the stone tools was a layer of volcanic ash. The geologists used the zircon fission track method to date that layer of ash. They got an age of 270,000 years. Using all 4 methods that they employed, the geologists concluded the site must be at least 250,000 years old. However, the archaeologists refused to accept the date. They said humans capable of making those artifacts didn't exist anywhere in the world 250,000 years ago. They hadn't evolved yet, what to speak of being present in North America. They considered the oldest human presence in North America to go back only about 20,000 years. So they refused to publish the age for the site given by their own hand-picked team of geologists. So Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues were a little surprised by that, so they decided to independently publish the age for the site in a journal called Quaternary Research. But when they did that, they experienced an extreme negative backlash from their colleagues in the scientific world because they had dared to publish something like this. Virginia Steen McIntyre wrote to one of the editors of the journal, "Not being an anthropologist, I didn't realize how deeply woven into our thought the current theory of human evolution has become. Our work at Huayatlaco has been rejected by most archaeologists because it contradicts that theory, period." So some of the cases I'm going to be talking about are from the more recent history of archaeology, some from the more distant history of archaeology. Some of the cases are going to be closer to what the mainstream concepts allow, and some are going to be further and further distant from what current ideas would consider possible. This is one of the founders of modern archaeology, Jacques Boucher-de-Perthes. In one of his excavations at Moulins-Quignon near Abbeville in northeastern France, he found an anatomically modern human jawbone. He found it in the bottom layers of his excavation with stone tools and weapons. According to modern geologists, that layer at Abbeville is about 430,000 years old. It was quite a controversial discovery, even in the 19th century. Many scientists could not accept that humans existed at that distant point in time. So some of them proposed, well, Boucher-de-Perthes must have been the victim of a hoax. Somehow or other, someone must have gone to some Roman cemetery, gotten a jawbone, 2,000 or 3,000 years old, and buried it in the excavation for him to find. And that's actually the explanation that we see in today's textbooks. However, what we do not see in today's textbooks is that after these hoax accusations came out, Boucher-de-Perthes made additional excavations at Moulins-Quignon. And in these additional excavations in the same location, he found over 100 additional anatomically modern human bones and teeth in the same formation, which to me indicates a human presence going back over 400,000 years. And I reported on this case in this paper, which was later published in a peer-reviewed conference proceedings volume. Recently, just last year, archaeologists reported the discovery of footprints at a place called Happisburgh in the United Kingdom. They were found in a formation that it is at least 780,000 years old and is perhaps up to 1 million years old. The archaeologists who studied the footprints published results suggesting they are consistent with anatomically modern human footprints. For example, they studied the foot index, which is the width divided by the length times 100. The average for all of the Happisburgh footprints was 39. The average for living Native American Indians is again 39. The average for living Eskimos today, their foot index is 38.26. And other features of the footprints were consistent with those of modern human beings. Now, of course, they did not believe that humans like us existed at that time. They don't think Homo sapiens existed over 780,000 years ago. So they attributed the footprints to a species called Homo antecessor, an ape man that they believe inhabited Europe at that time. But from the evidence itself, they could just as well have been made by humans like us. And there is evidence that anatomically modern humans existed at that time. This is the Buenos Aires skull, which was discovered early in the 20th century in Argentina. Researchers were conducting digging, and they had gone down about 45 feet, and they encountered a solid layer of limestone rock, locally known as Tosca. And after they broke through that layer, they found a human skull cap of an anatomically modern human type in the Pre-Ensenadan formation, which geologists consider to be 1.5 million years old. This discovery was reported to the scientific world in the primary scientific literature by the South American scientist Florentino Ameghino. I reported on this case and some others in this paper presented at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress in Cape Town, South Africa. Many people have heard of Olduvai Gorge. Many important discoveries have been made there. Most people are not aware of the first discovery that was made at Olduvai Gorge by the German scientist Hans Reck, who reported on it in 1913, he found a fairly complete anatomically modern human skeleton, that's the skull cap of it, buried in upper bed 2 of Olduvai Gorge. Upper bed 2 of Olduvai Gorge is between 1.15 and 1.7 million years ago. It was a very controversial discovery. There were decades of debate about it. Many people thought the debates were finally settled in the 1970s when a German scientist named Rainer Proch did a radiocarbon test on a fragment of bone that he said was from Reck's skeleton, and he got an age of less than